Welcome everyone to our second keynote lecture, which has been generously sponsored by my own institution, the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. And as our plenary speaker, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague and good friend, Dr. Richard Oosterhoff, who's a senior lecturer in history at Edinburgh. And Richard is a leading intellectual historian of the Renaissance and early modern period with enormous expertise in the history of science and mathematics. He's the author of Making Mathematical Culture, University and Print in the Circle of Lefebvre d'Étaples, which is a pivotal study of early modern mathematics encyclopedism. He's a co-author of Logo Daedalus, a wonderful name, and co-editor of Ingenuity in the Making, which both deal with the history of mind and ingenuity. And on a slightly different tack, he's also recently co-prepared a translation and edition of Leo Africanus's Cosmography and Geography of Africa, published by Penguin. Through Lefebvre and others, Richard has a profound interest in Cusanus, has published multiple articles and chapters relating to him and also his legacy, especially in mathematics. And today we're really privileged to have him speaking to us on the fascinating theme of the coercion of opposites, Renaissance visions of peace and freedom. So thank you very much.
That's very kind, Simon, and thank you to Simon and Bill for this event and for kicking off the society, which I think is a really exciting development. And thank you all for the very stimulating intellectual activity of the last day and a bit. I'm going to seek to try to bring down the tone if we can possibly do so. The plenary yesterday offered a really, really large frame, and I'm going to try to give us a very narrow frame, hopefully maybe flipping the telescope, if you like. So we're going to have to start somewhere quite particular. Let's begin in the middle of the French Wars of Religion in the autumn of 1576 in the city of Blois on the Loire River, where the Assembly of the Estates General is being held. King Henry III is presiding. He's 25 years old. His rise to the throne has been a surprise. His brother, Charles IX, only died a little earlier, struggling to deal with the rising tensions between Catholic and Protestant factions after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. And when Charles died of tuberculosis in 1574, Henry rushed back to France to be crowned. And his instincts had been to search for a kind of harmony between the factions, even though the horrors of 1572 had led to two more waves of war across France, including the bloody, famous, desperate sieges of Sancerre and La Rochelle. In May of 1576, Henry had been forced into an awkward peace, offering the Huguenots some concessions in the Edict of Beaulieu, one of them being this meeting of the Estates General. The Estates General, beginning in November of 1576, was a critical moment for reinforcing this fragile peace. Henry was hoping to negotiate a longer-lasting harmony through the ancient convocation of the estates, the clergy, the nobility, the commoners, asking them for subsidies to set taxes and obtain privileges. Clergy and nobility were largely successful in shutting out nearly all the Huguenot representatives, and Henry's own immediate need was money. A decade of war had depleted the treasury, and he expected, wisely, war again. So we know how this story continues. Henry's unsuccessful. When he dies in 1585, he provided no heir, and his legacy was overshadowed by a myth that emphasized his ineffectiveness. The emblem of his ineffectiveness is often his mignons, his court favorites, who were invoked by later historians to suggest the dissolutions of court pleasures as a kind of distraction. He was fond of cultured readings of poetry and music, and in his early days as king, he substituted one of his 4 weekly meetings with the Privy Council for an hour after dinner for an hour of discussions instead of philosophy and eloquence. And he discussed this with this close circle of favorites, these mignons. This Académie du Palais, the Palace Academy, met in the Louvre, but drew upon several of the figures associated with the cutting edge of intellectual life in Paris. Ronsard, Antoine de la Baïf, poets such as Clément Marot, and so on. Was this a distraction from public life? I'm persuaded by one or two historians who point out that this instead seems to be the response of an inexperienced young ruler seeking to educate himself in the arts needed to rule wisely. The Estates General at Blois as an entry point into how mathematics came into early modern politics. That's my target. The entire court came to Blois. The king maintained his household rule and routines there with some changes. Instead of holding his customary public audiences during dinner every day, he moved those audiences after dinner, and then 3 times a week he held instead public lectures, or rather lectures from the Palace Academy for his court, with the entire court expected to be in attendance. And if we follow the timeline of Robert Seeley, lectures on the Aristotelian virtues began in November, conducted through early January of 1577, which were then followed by a new suite of lectures on the structure of the universe, mathematics. And among the many figures of the Palace Academy, I'm going to focus on 2 speaking during these months. On the one hand, the philosopher, poet, and mathematician Pontus de Thiard, and also the eminent jurist Jean Bodin, in an effort to get at this telling conjunction, I think, between the history of mathematics, philosophy, and politics. Before I get to the narrative, however, I want to take a step back a little bit in order to explain why I think this might matter to people thinking through the legacy of Nicholas of Cusa. The big story, of course, is themes of freedom and coercion that underlie our narratives of progress. And how does, one of these big questions is how mathematics fits into that. These affect the interpretation of what Nicholas of Cusa might mean in the history of philosophy and in broader cultural histories. Let's take as our emblem Alexandre Coiré, the Russian émigré who radiated post-war optimism about the Western project, keeping at length the Eastern Bloc. There exist many versions, redactions of this. We heard some of them yesterday, actually, described by John Milbank. There's versions, let's think of Carsten Harries, constructivism of a pluriform perspectivalism, and so on, right? And you might think also of Francis Yates's study of the French academies as following in this optimistic 20th century modernist vein. But there's a pessimistic version of that tale I think we need to keep in mind as well. We can detect it already in the early Frankfurt School, which sets up the history of philosophy around mathematics as a kind of original sin of modernity, based in principle on coercive ways of engaging the world, a grid flattening the world into 2 dimensions. So on the one hand, in this book, Horkheimer and Adorno, use Baconian science as a totem, but notice they have to defend the fact that Bacon is not supposed to be a mathematical. They're assuming science is mathematical, and that's the key narrative they want to interject in. And we can find lots of variants of this narrative. I think there's one we might think of all as where Duns Scotus is the devil. There's others that have to do with mathematization of cells. We could think of even Isaiah Berlin, but certainly Foucault, thinking of the Enlightenment grid of rationality, which follows upon a certain vision of mathematized reason. Ong, thinking about the switch out of dialectic into, shall we say, a mathematization of logic, which leads into ways of thinking about political engineering. I think Catherine Pickstock has a narrative about this with respect to Peter Ramus and the reception of Ong. Again, it's the flattening of the world into a grid that's in view. This lovely book by Jennifer Morgan picks up a version of this, of course, and you can find lots of versions of this in the history of accounting, when she looks at how numbers transform individuals crossing the Atlantic, coerced into crossing the Atlantic. Numbers hide in very kind of key ways, monetize their narratives, dehumanizing them. So does it have to be this way? And this room full of readers of Nicholas of Cusa recognize how uncomfortably he sits in this story, what differentiates himself from these flattening cartographies I've mentioned. So one way to deal with this might be Milbank's suggestion that the metaphysical imagination has shrunk into modernity. It's flattened out, or it's become a cartographer's dream. There's another, and there is much use, I think, in a view that Cusanus represents in relationship to that view, a road not taken. I'm going to push on a different tack here, working within the practices of mathematical reasoning that we find in the late Renaissance, and slowly thickening ties to political philosophy that show how Nicholas of Cusa was co-opted, read, taken up in different ways. So let's get stuck in to the real thing. I hope that's just convincing as a way of keeping us melancholic about modernity, I suppose. So we don't have the scripts of all the lectures the Palace Academy presented to Henry III and his court, but we do have a whole cloud of texts that tell us what kind of materials attracted him, catching the royal interest. So we can think of the poets Ronsard, Jamine, and others who, as mentioned, presided over the lectures on the virtues into January 1577. But the impresario who took the lead in the following months was Pontus de Thiers. I've mentioned him. He achieved fame as a poet on the one hand. Let's think about poiesis as the word behind poet here, out of some discussions yesterday. He's especially noted, however, for his learning in mathematics and natural philosophy. He later becomes an important bishop at court. His earliest works included studies of music, astronomy, and astrology, including some practical things and updated ephemerides and so on. In particular, the lectures that he organized in 1577 seem to have been related to the topics of his dialogue, L'Univers, Discours des partis et de la nature du monde, first published in 1557. Thiers republished a second version of this book, however, in the year immediately following these lectures, expanded and beefed them up, and it seems very clear that his attention has been recaptured by this topic, and it seems that's why he's brought in, precisely because of this topic. It has a new preface to the king himself, in which Thiers sketches out the studies he's proposed to the king. So it's not enough for a king to be merely virtuous, to know lots of languages, diverse histories or customs of many countries. That might be a dig at Baudin at this point. But a king needs to learn intellectual diversity and harmony. The various sects of the philosophers need to be understood and harmonized in their reasoning about natural causes. So in particular, a king should acquire, as a rare accomplishment and precious enabling of the mind, this understanding that part of mathematics which, beyond its pleasures, serves the wondrous use of setting out and ordering the political life: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy. And then that carries on through a distinction of the various causes, proportions, movements of seasons, time, etc. And that's a suite of studies that then is rounded out by thinking about geography and then the physical history that fills in that geography. Again, this is stretching the bounds of what we might think of as mathematics, and it's even stretching to the edges of a Renaissance vision of mathematics, and yet that's the category under which this is being packaged. The book proceeds as a dialogue between three figures: Thiers himself and then his two guests, Curieux and Hieronyme, Jerome. So Thiers has had a fine meteroscope made, he says. And then he invites these two guests into his home. They look at the meteroscope and they start discussing. So it's, there's this object that serves as the prompt for discussion. It's an armillary sphere. Of course, it's the common thing through which you start study of two-sphere astronomy in the Renaissance. So this is what we get when we're reading these dialogues at one level. The book takes up the Renaissance textbook on spherical cosmography. It rises through topics such as Earth as at the center, the number and composition of the heavenly spheres, introduction to the zodiac, epicycles, the rays of the sun and planetary influences on Earth. These are all the standard things that you're going to read in every textbook. And then it moves back through the elements to the analogy of human as microcosm, which then leads him upwards to discussion of souls, including things like soul as the proof for the existence of God, the eternity of the world, and so on. So we find a complete history, as one of his friends says in the prefatory material. This is a complete history of the cosmos from its beginning to its end. So it's a natural history that is mathematical, if you like. That's the discipline holding it together. So what does that mean? What does it mean to conceive of this text as mathematical? And remember, freedom and constraint, that's a theme that I want us to keep in mind here. So the context in which these topics, they're not presented precisely as given here, but think about the context of a dialogue. That's how we know the lectures are presented at court. They're presented as, witty, sort of back and forth that entertains as well as informs. The context of Blois and the Estates General in 1577, I think, helps us unlock the puzzle. It shows the position Thiard wishes mathematics to occupy. The round of topics I've just listed serve as a primer, but then jammed in between all of those topics, you're going to find the most contentious key questions of the day. The debated status of the spheres, the soul as proof of God, the immortality of the soul, the eternity of the world, all these sorts of, they're topoi in a way, but they're topoi that haven't been resolved. Over and again, these questions are presented historically. So Pontus and Curieux in particular, but Hieronyme as well, lead the reader through a recapitulation of the history of these debates from antiquity up to the present, adjudicating as they go the conflicting interpretation of the moderns, leaving the reader to look for a harmony, right? So that he doesn't resolve these things. Now, if you transpose these into these dinner performances of disputations, the pedagogic device makes the consumer, the audience, the student, the king himself. So it becomes less surprising then that the book is not just a handbook for technique. It's a lot more than, you don't learn how to do mathematics here. The king doesn't learn how to do mathematics here because he isn't required to do that. That's what you get technicians to do. The king is not a practitioner. He's the adjudicator. He's the judge. So they prime him as one who takes account of all the expert opinions and then resolves them in himself, harmonizing the opposites. I'll come on to Cusanus a little bit in a second via someone else. But first, let's see how this works a little bit in action. The debate over the solidity of the spheres is a good example, or what we call the fluidity of the heavens. The fluidity option was a Stoic option that had been advanced by one of the royal professors in the previous two generations, Jean Pena. The stakes for the debate are far-reaching. There's the Copernican hypothesis, which, with sun as center, doesn't necessitate fluid heavens, but it did provoke the question over and again, right? This is a regular thing in Copernican discourse in the late 16th century. And recent comets, 1572, but a number of others as well, had sharpened discussion about whether comets existed above or below the lunary sphere, whether cometary exhalations can affect anything on Earth. So in this dialogue, the character of Thiard, he sets this question, which suits his role as the host, right? Bringing in the other people. He's also representing a figure of kind of personable, learned, and friendly knowledge. It's his experience that sets him up. And so, for example, he relates how he had been observing these kind of comets and planets years ago with Jacques Pelletier-Dumont, his friend. And on the 24th of May, 1552, they had observed that Jupiter's rays were strong enough to cast a shadow into the room that they were observing from on Thiard's estate at Bissy. So discussions here of the heavens composition follows some just after this point about observation and how that fits into the social life of Thiard. Again, Thiard is bringing up the question then where he suggests it's odd for planets somehow to be dots embedded within crystalline spheres that are grinding around, interlocking crystalline spheres with extra circles for epicycles. Wouldn't those push those dots into other spheres? Like, does this even work physically? That's his question. Especially, when you observe planets at apogee, on the farthest extent they are out. Neither of Thiart's guests are happy with this suggestion at all. Curieux is the figure who represents mathematical arguments. Throughout the book, he embodies the characteristics that Renaissance scholars would have of a mathematician, especially those critical. So he's pointy, almost unsociably sharp. His ingenuity pushes conceptual consistency too far, to the point that he's irritating to people around him. So to Thiart's suggestion, Curieux gives an unyielding answer. He says, the smooth circular movements of the heavens need to persist. For them to persist, you need solids. You know, think ball bearings. You need to have something that can kind of move in crystalline motions, and they need to be circular. How do you do that with fluids, right? When Thiart responds that surely such large grinding spheres would create a kind of sound, the other guest answers, Jérôme, or Hieronyme, who he's introduced at the beginning of the dialogue as the critic of mathematics, usually on the basis of Christian orthodoxy. And the heavenly music, he points out, in fact must exist because Job speaks of it, the psalmist speaks of it, he's probably thinking of Psalm 18:19. And nodding along, Curieux adds, not only are the heavenly spheres very far from us, but they're particularly distant from sense and from understanding, sens et d'intelligence. So we can only judge how things are with difficulty, with uncertainty. The discussion closes in aporia, and it moves on. So scholarship on this work tends to assume that actually Thiart was sympathizing with the enlightened voice of reason in Curieux, or opposite readers insist that Hieronyme's pronouncements on theological orthodoxy show a kind of fideism on his part. It's possible, I suppose, but it's also true that in this 1578 souped-up post-King version, if you like, Thiart often expanded upon the set of evidence and arguments for theological orthodoxy, so that pushes on the Hieronyme as Thiart's actual voice. But I think this binary misses the point. So read as a whole, the discussion raises an uncertain question and then does not decide. The point is, they have expert opinions. The expert opinions cannot be resolved except by the person who's authorized at the center to bring those opinions together into a balanced judgment. The reader, the king. There's more to say about that, but I want to move on to some points about mathematical practice. So, we shouldn't see the king as a practitioner, but as a judge, I say. For Thiart, mathematics is much more than a set of techniques. It assembles and orders a mass of details into an overarching whole, smoothing them into an intellectual armature. Milbank yesterday used the word carapace. That's quite nice. I like that. The details are unruly. All three figures are constantly negotiating the catalogue of pinch points in the battle of ancients and moderns, the question of inspiration and enthusiasm in relation to planetary influence as well as modes of creation, human creation, the uncomfortable amassing of information about an expanding globe filled with intriguing non-Christians. But these unruly details are held together by this carapace, an imagination that's trained in an encyclopedic version of the quadrivium, which smooths everything into a whole. Now, we might think we know where this fits into stories of mathematical reasoning, freedom, and constraint. So one side picks the practitioners. It fits with the story of architecture, engineering, the intuition of Peter Reimus, that one should actually go to the dockworkers and the builders to see what mathematics really means, and you could extend this utilitarian vision of power to mapmakers. And we can see echoes of this. We have Cusanus echoes probably in our minds right now. There's another side, of course, which focuses on the literary Neoplatonism of the French 16th century, where poetry, music, rational inquiry, eloquent French free us from the shackles of religion and lead us into the l'âge classique of Descartes, Pascal, the Point Royal logicians. You know what I'm talking about. And that second side is generally where we find interpretations of these moves, generally where we find Thiart, for example. And I'm drawing out this dichotomy partly because we often are forced to place Cusanus into one or another of these parallel genealogies as well. I'll come back to that. I want to connect these two sides by pointing to a bigger tectonic shift in how mathematics was conceived at this moment in the age of Henry III and Pontus de Thiers. And this has to do with how you think about mathematical proof, what a mathematical narrative that is reliable works, how it works. So I'm going to collapse a really large argument that I've made elsewhere into a few minutes, so I'm sorry for the fact that it's going to be leaping a bit. We could look at antiquity, but let's look at the medieval Boethius, which includes Euclid. Who is Euclid? Euclid is the standard for how to reason mathematically until relatively recently, shall we say, mostly through the 17th century and beyond even. I still find mathematicians tell me this, and it's actually Euclid. They say, you should try it sometime. I think it's really fascinating as a move. Euclid, of course, looks different in the medieval period, especially in the translation of Boethius, where it's just a series of propositions shorn of any of the proofs. The way you reason most of the time, if you're a schoolboy, in Euclidean, making Euclidean moves is through the propositions. The result of that is versions, when there are versions of Euclid that are circulated, and they're not always circulated in full, and they're not circulated as widely as the Boethius transmission, you get enunciations by Euclid, but the demonstrations, the proofs, are conceived, even in terms of the mise en page, as commentary that can be recycled and shifted. They're unstable. The stable bit is the enunciations, the propositions, theorems, corollaries, and so on. This is a debate that carries through into the early age of print. That's how Euclid is presented. There's a number of points I'd want to make about authorship. So who you think Euclid really is, and whether you think Euclid actually authored the proofs, affects how seriously you take the reasoning of the proofs in this period. And in this period, you find versions where people are trying to work this out. This is Lefebvre d'Étaples' edition. He refers to Nicholas of Cusa in the preface. He's just published the great big 1514 Opera Omnia of Cusanus. And 2 years later, 3 years later, he produces this side-by-side version of two different translations of Euclid as an effort to get through what's really going on in the demonstrations and leaving it up to the reader to decide. In his context, I want to point out that intuitive, imaginative leaps from proposition to proposition, being able to visualize each proposition separately and leap without demonstration to the next one, is the normal way you're going to meet mathematics if you're a schoolboy. And that's true with Charles de Bovell's introduction to geometry, and he's drawing on a much larger tradition, one that's continuous with some of the problems that we see, I think. I think we can examine some of how Cusanus reasons within this tradition, this intuitive way of thinking about what you're doing when you're doing maths. And of course, this doesn't just affect geometry. This affects lots of other disciplines, which are reorganized in this kind of proposition by proposition way without stitching together the proposition by means of demonstrations. I'm not saying that the other doesn't exist. It does exist. It's just not the majority way of meeting mathematics in the classroom or elsewhere. Now, the person who there are a number. There's a big story about how this coalesced into an argument about how to do mathematical proof in the 1570s, and it's pan-European. There's a lot of things going on there, but Pontus de Thiers' friend Jacques Pelletier-Dumont, known as a poet, but who was one of the most talented mathematicians of his day as well, much better than Pontus de Thiers, and much better than almost anyone else, certainly way better than Peter Ramus, has picked up on this problem. And his version of the first fixed book of Euclid aims to solve it. He's also a close reader of Nicholas of Cusa, a major poet of the Pleiad. And in he introduces his edition of Euclid, in which he's offered new proofs, with a really, really telling. It's a letter that requires, I think, more careful reading than I've given it so far. Every time you read it, there's more things that come out of it. It looks at first as a standard, outstandingly eloquent, but standard example of the praise of mathematics genre. Other scholars have pointed out exactly where Nicholas of Cusa kind of fits into that. He doesn't name him, but there are themes that clearly come through. And you see all the kinds of things that we've been talking about. The idea that the sciences all depend upon a mathematics that has eternally been fixed in the divine mind, and that this divine mathematics is mirrored in the potential of the human mind, all that sort of thing is there kind of in nuce. I want to focus on Pelletier's allusions to the use of mathematics in a world of conflict as an example of harmony. So everything in the world can be turned to utilitarian purpose, or to beauty, or at least to serve as an example. Even the wars, poisons, and illnesses we've experienced teach us to care and to value the good things of life, as he says. In fact, the aspects of geometry are of such help to one another that they show everything in the nature of things to support and sustain one another. Actually, the laws of friendship has laws, are itself seen, friendship itself are seen in the likeness of shapes that share diameters. And there he's referring to proposition 1.4 of Euclid. I'll come to that. So this could be just Pythagorean or Platonic exuberance, except that Pelletier gives us the basis of this kind of harmony. So he constructs his argument for geometry's value on the basis of its peacemaking potential. No controversy or dispute can arise in this context, which is not immediately referred to the trust and test of truth. For the reasons of geometry do not persuade, but they compel. Even in their very order, in fact, by the leading of nature herself. It's a really interesting formulation, and it's consistent enough, and you can trace this in other places where people are starting to wonder, what is the nature of a demonstration? How does one statement lead to the next in a way that takes you somewhere unexpected that you didn't anticipate going? And is it coercive? Pelletier is drawing, of course, on the ineluctable character of axiomatic reasoning, right? The very reason that Aristotle gives this as the basis of logic in the posterior analytics. And this, of course, has been described as the basis of mathematical power, across the centuries. It still is. But he phrases this as a compulsion, not a free judgment. So when mathematical argument convinces, does it force the mind into predetermined channels, or does it draw the mind on with evocative allusivity, right? So I hope you can see how this relates to the rhetoric of proof, maybe even the proof of rhetoric, but that's a different paper. The rhetoric of proof in editions of Euclid. Is the real mathematical argument happening by way of long-range, leaping, large-scale intuitions? That's the world of Cusanus, most of the time. That's the world of Bavell and Peter Ramus, where the intuition of mechanical implications often takes one into the secrets of nature. You need to make that kind of leap in order to get past the problem of abstraction that Aristotle set in our way when we think mathematically. Pelletier himself insists not on persuasion, but on coercion, right? And rationes non persuadent, sed cogunt. And here he takes the side of the step-by-step calculation, what we might call the algorithm. Now, Pelletier does not shift over immediately, resolutely just pursuing one line of mathematics as coercion of the mind, etc. But he is committed enough to this idea that he picks one of the bigger fights in the history of Euclidean interpretation. The issue is superposition. Is it legitimate to prove the identity of two triangles by superimposing one upon the other? In fact, Euclid had assumed that this was okay. And indeed, most of the tradition had assumed this was okay up to this point. But the assumption there is that space is uniform. And it turns out this is an assumption that's no good in non-Euclidean geometry and of various kinds. Prior to Pelletier, nobody had questioned this principle, and Pelletier's extensive commentary on the question helped to make it this flashpoint in geometrical commentary over the next 2 centuries. So why does he do that? Well, proof does not admit intuition, but friendship has laws, and the laws are visible here. They demand formal austerity. I've been arguing that the 16th century French academies, as we could extend this picture also to the Collège Royal, which is full of people that Ramus has left behind as interested in mathematics and who are pursuing it in multiple directions between this point and the end of the century, and into the 17th as well. So I'm suggesting that these academy interests, which have been often reified as a kind of metaphysical escape from politics, in fact fit very directly with the interests of the French court. The Palace Academy of Henri III, far from distracting him from the real business of politics, give him options for achieving political harmony. So someone like Thiard presents mathematics as a capacious tool for managing the variety of things in the theater of the world. But his wasn't the only view available. Jean Bodin had participated as well in the same series. In fact, he participates all the way until the middle of February, at which point he loses favor because he's opposed to the king's policies in the first few months of the Palace Academy lectures. Now, we know Bodin best for his account of sovereignty, probably, setting in place the theory that was used to defend absolutism in France and then beyond, modifies reason of state literature, et cetera, et cetera. It's a, he presents this in his 10 books on the Commonwealth, or the La République, which is published first in 1576, so just on the eve of the Estates General, and which perhaps was the reason that he was invited to perform, to take part in the Palace Academy lectures at Blois. And this gargantuan treatise answered ancient political theory by testing it against a thorough reading of 16th century political history. But what's normally overlooked is the final chapter, where the systematicity, the scientific nature of the work as a whole is given validity by a study of mathematical harmony, the kind of proportions that properly relate the justice of a king to his subjects. Right? The king, the judge, how does he judge? With math. Justice, after all, is the last constraint. I mean, he's talked about the constraints of astrological forces. Book 4 and 5 are all about constraints of stars and climate, of course, which are related to one another, on a king's absolute sovereignty. And Bodin then follows Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but a number of other sources, he doesn't cite them all, in explaining the arithmetical justice in terms of equal distribution among equals, so that's a democratic form of proportion. It's arithmetical. Then geometrical justice, which provides a proportion to each according to their worth. That's aristocratic. So if you're more worthy, you deserve more. But then he finally argues, and this is his distinctive contribution, the superiority of harmonic justice, which he sees as monarchic, is in that it combines the other two forms of distribution. So the king both participates and relates equally to every subject as a sovereign. Yet he's also proportionally worthy more and more as the pinnacle of the aristocracy. And the implication is that harmonic justice, it's not clear that he gets all the details right here, but the suggestion is that harmonic justice is what sets limits, right? Just like stars and climate, harmonic justice sets limits on what the king can take on tax. And that's exactly what led to his opposition to the king at Blois. He says to the king, actually, there are limits on how much tax you can take from any of the estates. As you might guess, that doesn't lead to his expulsion from the court. The king actually likes him, but politically, he's on the outs at that point. The king needs money. What I want you to see is how Bodin seeks to render justice as an algorithm. So what belongs to each person is set by the mathematical simplicity of a calculation. Turn the crank, the machine spits out the number. So this fits with the trajectory of Bodin's 10 books on the Commonwealth. which responds to the resistance theologies of the Huguenots that defended the broader customs and judgments of common belief, a pluriform world, right? A world of custom, a world of negotiation, centered on community judgment. Baudin's answer is that of a lawyer, giving a hard-edged, sort of thinner system of law and rule, here embodied in an algorithm of justice. And Baudin makes the king the practitioner, interestingly, compared to Thiard's vision here. The king is the practitioner of the algorithm, right? That's how he dispenses justice. So that's an interesting comparison point, I think. When I say thick and thin rules, I have in the back of my head Lorraine Daston's distinction between thick rules where judgment is about habituation in certain virtues of, and the habituated person is the rule for knowing how to apply justice well, which she opposes to a thinner system, the system under which we live, where every detail is spelled out in a sentence, the thinner rules of law. And we see this kind of negotiation, I think, right at this moment between these two frameworks for thinking about rule. So, and I want to stress that Baudin's mode of thinking about justice is not the only way to see it. Aviva Rothman has pointed out how Johannes Kepler, a Lutheran astronomer to the Prague court, responds to Baudin's vision of peace through harmonic coercion, if you like, by offering a very different account of harmony as the principled form of pluralism. Right? Harmony arises for him in music. It's when multiple groups create a whole together by virtue of their difference, by virtue of voicing different tones. So that's a model in which mathematics does not drive one, but draws one, it attracts one. So he offers, Kepler, we might say, offers mathematics as a training, a moral training, more akin to Pontus de Thiard's effort to inculcate poetic judgment, if you like, in Henry II through means of mathematics. So what does this say about the legacy of Nicholas of Cusa's vision of mathematics? Is it about open worlds and infinite universes, or is it about coercive, technocratic, closed regimes? Pontus de Thiard, taken in tandem with Jean Baudin, I hope reminds us that we can't untangle these things very easily. So the voice of coercive reasoning here is the person who's closest as a reader, but also most clever as an interpreter of Nicholas of Cusa, Jacques Pelletier-Dumont. Nevertheless, you can see Thiard will be familiar with the Cusan heritage. And his dialogue offers a pluralistic poetic that only holds in place massive disagreements that bubble below the armature of the arts disciplines. And as lovely and as pluralistic as that seem, he still wants to ensure there is a carapace. And there's a sense in which I'm not sure it's possible to take account of all the options on play, all the opposites that need harmonizing, without this sense of, bubbling below the surface, below the edge below the force of the carapace, at least not in the context of the wars of religion. Thiard is more Cusa than he is Thomas Hobbes, let's say. But his proximity to Baudin should suggest how uneasy we might be with his metaphysical visions of peace. So Agamben, Milbank, and others have taught us to see metaphysics as a political enterprise in which human activity constructs a model or a representation of the universe and exerts power by the very enunciation of that model. So that should make us suspicious, indeed, of modern mathesis. But I'm not sure we can simply roll back to a Cusan metaphysics. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Richard, for such a fascinating tour of mathematics and politics. From the moment we were kind of swept into Blois in 1577, it was wonderful. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, especially as you've linked in to so many themes we've been discussing as well. So let me open the floor to questions.
Suddenly realizing I need my pen, I think. I'm going to, there we go.
Yes, Steve.
You mentioned that for sort of the average schoolboy learning his Euclid in this period, the proofs would not have been a part of the education. Can you just talk a little bit about what was the nature of mathematical reasoning in the classroom? was it rote? Was it learning these propositions as if they were unquestionable maxims that only required a kind of rote memorization? Or was there another way, a different kind of reasoning that students were being trained in?
I think it's quite local. That's really,
Between them?
yeah, that's fascinating. And it's hard to give a universal answer because this is centuries where things are shifting hugely. So Vienna in the 15th century, where Regiomontanus is arising, clearly has something going on with it where lots of people are learning maths. Schoolboys, what are they? Well, some of them are grammar school, 12 to 15 kind of. Some of those might be actually starting the arts course at various of the universities. Different universities have very different cultures in this respect, and I think we need to pull that out. Paris, around 1500, the thing that I focused on in the past is how schoolboys are being asked to learn how to calculate in particular ways. So when you go through this textbook, sort of a set of topics, you become a practitioner because you're given tables and you're told, here's how you do sexagesimal arithmetic. This is what comes out at the end. Now go apply that. Oh, and by the way, you can think of yourself as a cosmographer like Cusa now, which is an interesting technician's view of how, so some places are doing that. And increasingly over the 16th century, the evidence you have from looking at marginalia is that students are increasingly doing that sort of thing as time unfolds. That said, the encyclopedic ideal is extremely strong still. And so the expectation, especially early on, is going to be that you need a smattering of things. And you need to be able to taste what it feels like to think with mathematical objects. So Charles de Bovell is fascinating because on the one hand, he seems, he's a very close reader of Nicholas of Cusa, especially on mathematics, especially on mathematical, what he thinks of as reasoning that you learn in mathematics that you can then apply to metaphysical kinds of questions. And Emmanuel Faye has written some wonderful things about links between Bovell and readings of Nicholas of Cusa on this, so I'd send you to that. But when he writes a textbook, he wants to construct his propositions so tightly together that they become axiomatic in the way that the common notions at the beginning, so he almost wants to think of propositions in ways that you think of common notions at the beginning of Euclid, which are basics that you can't say no to. They're so obvious. And he wants you to be able to move from proposition to proposition through dozens and dozens of propositions, thinking with mathematical objects, right? Here's a line, this is what it does, these are other kinds of lines, this is how they behave, this is how they move, this is what happens when you draw them, that sort of thing, without having to be attending to demonstration. Now, he does demonstrations at different points, but his demonstrations are sometimes heterodox and sometimes erroneous, precisely because he's really keen to involve as many ways of thinking about mathematical narrative as possible. So Reviel-Netz is a really interesting person to think with, I think, in asking yourself, how is a mathematical narrative constructed? What role do proofs play in that? And he and Reviel-Netz, I think, would have had a really interesting conversation about that. Now, why do I say that at some length? Bovell is stuck into the end of Gregor Reich's Margarita Philosophica. I forget which edition, but a very early edition. And so part of the best-selling kind of encyclopedic textbook of the 16th century, and therefore schoolboys are meeting this all over Europe. It's not the only version of things. Is that rote? Probably not, but often in practice, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Monica?
I think it's a textbook, and I think that is a normative text. So did you find proof of what you told us elsewhere, or is it just in this book?
Which one? The text. So the one I'm describing right now is a textbook from the Circle of Lefebvre d'Étaples around the year 1500, 1503 is the first edition. Or are you thinking of Pontus de Thiers' 1578 set of discourses? Yeah, which is covering textbook topics, but it's elevating the discourse to become witty and pointed. So as to train a courtly reader, and I'm suggesting including the king, without boring them too much, but also helping them to learn the modes of reason that are expected in this domain. So it's a textbook-y sort of thing, but I wouldn't call it.
What I'm asking is,
Yeah.
you can write a book about the classroom and what happens there,
Yeah.
and it might be normative, it might be
Yeah.
just an ideology, what you think should be.
Yeah.
But did you compare it with other sources?
So I think you find the full range of sources here, but I wouldn't want to drive too hard a line between textbooks that are just used by teenagers and the kinds of thing that a courtier might pick up in order to brush up on the essentials, in order to have that someone like Gabriel Harvey would do. Because Gabriel Harvey, when he's trying desperately, he's on the outside of the late 16th century English court. Philip Sidney says, go away, read Sacrobosco's Sphere, read the basics of astronomy that the university kids are reading. And he takes that with him as his entree into court. He's learned because he can deal with this kind of material. So I see your point, but there's a sense in which all of these books, of course, bear with them the force of, a normative force in that they're trying to persuade someone of something. Am I sidestepping what you're saying? Am I sidestepping your suggestion?
No.
Okay, I don't want to. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? David?
I wanted to go back to this point about the compel, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
And you said, if I heard right, it's compulsion in the sense, the Kogun,
Yeah.
it's compulsion in the sense that it forces the mind along a single track.
Yeah.
So it's not about sort of my subjective
Yeah.
apprehension and whether I'm persuaded or not, or persuaded in one way or
Yeah.
differently
Yeah.
than a colleague or something, but it forces the mind. And that raised a question of the kind of claim of a universal, which is I don't think the term you use, but I was wondering about that, especially then when I saw, I'm glad you left it up here, the ordine ipso,
Yeah.
that nature itself. So it's a
Yeah.
naturalization of
Yeah.
a single order
Yeah.
that the mind is compelled along
Yeah.
by virtue of its singularity, of its
Mhm.
uniqueness.
Mm.
And I've been reading Peter Harrison about the idea of the emergence of a, quote, neutral epistemic space
Mhm.
in the 17th century,
Mhm.
in which, per his narrative, and I'm
Yeah,
asking
yeah,
you to
yeah,
respond,
yeah.
but how this fits into that,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
this is a very different
Yeah.
time, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? He has
Yeah.
it kind of happening later.
Yeah.
Among the natural theologians, after the wars of religion,
Mhm.
there are no sects in geometry,
Mhm.
seeking a kind of new universal,
Mhm.
not rooted in the particularities of
Mhm.
Christian sort of doctrines, which are
Mhm.
cause of strife, but instead in this nice neutral space, but one which, he says, self-consciously, or maybe not
Yeah.
self-consciously, but somehow took over the same
Yeah.
universal doctrinal
Yeah.
office
Yeah.
of Christian
Yeah.
theology,
Yeah.
and instead substituted
Yeah.
the epistemic
Yeah.
space. That's
Yeah.
precisely this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you make of, how does this fit into that narrative, and what do you make of it happening 150 years too soon by his
Yeah. Yeah. That's so. I haven't read this bit by Harrison, and I clearly need to do so. There are two places I have been using to think about this, and I don't have a settled view yet, but it's something I'm hugely interested in. The one place is René Daston's little essay against nature, which talks about natura in the Middle Ages, a 12th century Platonist she's thinking of, but she's thinking about everybody, using nature as a way of talking about an objective space in which to work out social issues. Right, you shunt the responsibility over to whatever your order of nature happens to be. And I think she would want to fit this, she would just see that as fitting into this. I feel that it's not a high resolution, it's a short book, but I think that's useful to think with. The more historical specific thing I've been reading, just Vera Keller's new book called The Interlopers, which is a reimagining of what scientific culture at the early Stuart court is like. So a little bit later than this. She has a wonderful introduction which I think locked together an insight for me about how a lot of historiography in history of science, intellectual history more generally, I think, has been fascinated by Baudin, but the after story of Baudin, Lipsius, and so on, where a Stoic order of nature presents an imperial sort of calm and remove, in which natura is a spirit, right? Which is interconfessional, supraconfessional, and where self-discipline is, the care of the self is the narrative that drives us towards Boyle, drives us towards characters, gentlemen of science, all that sort of thing. And that's there's something fascinating about that. Vera is critical of that narrative because she points out that she wants to talk about interlopers, people who come into the picture in order to disrupt it and claim that their disruptive power is precisely the thing that helps smash the crystalline spheres, smash the evenness of nature. But when they do that, they're claiming interest. They're claiming political interest because of the moment in which they're living, which is this kind of moment, right? French wars of religion, what's happening? You impose a very, you need a carapace, something to manage the unruliness of both observation and people, in order to impose a kind of order on something that is inherently of a moment that is all about crisis and about that requires reaction. So what's the fundamental point? I think already in this moment what you're seeing is an effort to talk about uniformity and the universal precisely as a way to manage the fact that it's boiling. It's a symptom of disorder. Yeah, it's the flip side of disorder. It's a flip side of disorder, just as the way coercion is the flip side of peace. You only get it if you manage things. That's the way I'm thinking about it right now. But
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have coming to the end? But if anyone, yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I'll throw it out there. I'm not sure if it's a good one or not. So I'm just trying to think through sort of two aspects of this mathematization of politics, I guess, in the period that you're studying. On one hand, when we were talking about, or when we were starting
Yeah.
with the optimism versus pessimism,
Yeah.
I had a certain picture in my mind
Yeah.
of how the mathematization of the world goes bad and turn people into
Yeah.
numbers and
Yeah,
things
yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of, that's where my brain was primed to go.
Yeah.
But then we ended up talking about, good old-fashioned arithmetical versus geometrical equality and stuff that, is in Aquinas and the Aristotelian tradition before that. And so Baudin seems to kind of just be riffing on that sort of well-established trope. And he's throwing in the harmonic thing, which is interesting. But it doesn't seem, I don't know, I'm just wondering, is his rehearsal of the arithmetic versus geometric equality and things like that, is that just a different thing than the sort of more sinister mathematization of the human world that is in the making simultaneously, or are those more intimately connected as two sides of the same coin?
So I think there are lots of variegation to observe in the way people are thinking about the world increasingly in algorithmic ways.
Okay.
But the impulse to algorithmize, what an ugly word, but maybe appropriately so, seems to me the same in each of these places. So let's go to another place for thinking about what I think is a similar impulse, which is natural language projects, which are emerging in the 16th century. You can find stuff in Ramus, and a lot of the same intuitions about there being something underneath the structure of the world that you can isolate, or that is actually the real structure of things. The Mathesis story of the early 17th century feeds into this. But people are doing this in terms of language, right? So they're saying, how do we simplify the world into something that allows us to reconfigure it in a way that allows us to do something with it? And by the end of this, the early Royal Society, what's his name? Wilkins, John Wilkins. He's the hub around which the early Royal Society is gathering. The book that perplexes everyone is a book that, it's simplified, it's a massive book, there's lots of pages, it's doing lots of different things. Turns the world into ones and zeros. Like he's the guy who gives you like binary code for thinking through what's going on in language. So finding an algorithm to simplify all the injustices, complications, and oppositions that allows you just to say, no, but this is the truth. That's the intuition I want to aim at with that. And I think I see that in the Baudin example, but it's not the Baudin example that makes that intuition, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, the way you described it there almost makes me think of the Confucian rectification of names thing, which came up recently. I was doing the rounds on Twitter because there was someone found a news article from some gathering of Nobel Prize laureates from the 80s, where the headline was, they decide that we need to go back to the Confucian doctrine of the rectification of names so that we can organize language properly. And then basically all the political problems in the world will just kind of solve themselves.
Yeah. It's lovely. It's a regime of measurement of a different kind, isn't it? Yeah.
Wonderful. I think we've come to the end, but clearly it's raised lots of fascinating questions. I think turning the kind of microscope has also allowed us to see the wider vision. So thank you so much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.